Hi everyone, welcome back to another lecture summary. Alright, this time we're going to continue with our social studies and we're going to talk about Unit 2 of Issue 1, which is deciding what is good for society, which is essentially part of the Citizenship and Governance issue. Alright, so I'm going to use this document, this worksheet again, like I always do, and let's just get straight into it. So these are some learning objectives, right? Yeah, I think you can just take some time to just look it over, and by the end of today's lecture, you'll be able to understand and achieve all of these things. Okay, so the overarching question for this lecture is how do we decide what is good for society? So this is a unit where you get introduced to the concept of governance. Okay, specifically understanding the different types of systems of governance, the challenges that comes with governing in a democracy, and as well as some measures of good governance. So we're going to see what is considered to be good leadership or good governance in today's world. First, let's basically start off with a simple overview of the different kinds of systems of governance that we have in today's world, right? And in this case, the definition that you should understand is that the government or a government is defined as the system or group of people that are governing anything that is an organized community. In this case, we're talking about the organized community as a state, a country. Okay, so governments are a means. So they're essentially caretakers and an organization that enforces and determines policy. So the organization being the country, obviously. So every government is established under some kind of supreme law, which is the constitution, which is what you already learned in Unit 1. Okay, so when we talked about the Constitution of Singapore. Okay, so there are many different types of systems of governance in the world today. Let's just take a look at some common examples. All right. Now, first we have what is known as an autocracy. Now you might have heard this word when it came to what people describe as a dictatorship, right? So it is essentially a government who has what we call absolute power. Absolute power means simply the power is in a control of a certain minority group, like a small number of people, or just even a single person in some cases, and there are minimal restraints on the decision making and popular control. So an autocracy, essentially is a rule of one. So whatever this person or this small group of people say will become the law and everything that is governing in that country. Okay, so doesn't matter what the people want. There's no judiciary or there's no free judiciary or legislature to go against the decisions made by these those in the autocratic decision making government, right? So essentially these people can do basically anything that they want, even if it is illegal or it could even be contravening some human rights. Okay, so some examples, non-exhaustive of course, includes governments of North Korea, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, or former governments of Saudi Arabia and Cuba, who are known to be very autocratic in nature. Now, remember that this is a concept that, although you may not be very familiar with, but I think you should know that governments come on all sorts of spectrums. So nothing is 100% autocracy, nothing is 100% democracy. It's all on a spectrum somewhere between autocracy and absolute freedom. Yeah. Okay. Second type is anarchy. Now, anarchy is a bit special because anarchy is actually a state where there is no government at all. So, a state of disorder and a state of absence of law. Okay, so you might have used the word anarchy in your essays or in your English composition as a metaphor for when something goes terribly wrong or is a very chaotic scenario. Yes, all right. So it's usually resulting from a failure of government, especially in a time where perhaps there was a civil war or there was a coup d'etat. Yeah. So anarchy is usually as a result of that. So example, the most prominent one, the most recent one would be the Somalia, from 1991 to 2006 after the military government collapsed after conflict, right? Somalia essentially had no um, government to speak of. There was basically anarchy all over the country, right? And of course, we all know what happened to Somalia afterwards. So Somalia is in a process of recovering from that period of time. Next, uh, totalitarianism. All right, so this is similar to what we talked about before, which is the autocratic system. So totalitarianism is when a single political authority regulates total control. So yeah, so centralized control. So the main difference is that a totalitarian government is not just made of one person. It is usually, or in fact most of the time, made up of political authority, right? So it's centralized, means any decision must be made by this specific group of people in this part of the country. So examples, those that take history, for example, you would know that the USSR under Stalin was a sort of totalitarian government because everything had to be reported back to the Politburo in Moscow, and of course it went straight to Joseph Stalin. Hitler as well, he took control of all decisions that had to be made, so everything needs to go through Hitler in Berlin. And of course, today's North Korea with Kim Jong Un, and well, yeah. Okay. Next, we have tyranny. So tyrannical government is one that again has absolute rule. So you see that there are many different ways that we can describe these governments. All right. So it's not a one size fit all approach when we try to classify certain governments. All right. Yeah. So here, an arbitrary exercise of power. So this is similar to the autocratic system and the totalitarianism system. However, there is one very important distinction, or not distinction, a characteristic rather of a tyrannical government, is the separation of power is not a requisite. Remember in Unit 1, we talked about separation of powers as established by the Constitution of Singapore. Yeah. If there is no separation of power, which means legislature, executive, and judiciary all function under essentially the same ideology to the same person, for example, that is a tyrannical government. Okay, so separation of power is very important. We'll take a look at that later when we talk about Singapore's government. Okay, examples again, North Korea has popped up multiple times now, and the currently the junta government of Myanmar can be considered a tyrannical government as well. Next, we have a theocracy. Now, theocracy is where leaders are essentially considered to be divinely guided. So people that rule in the name of a god, for example. Okay, so the principles of such a government is usually very consistent with the principles of that religion. For example, one of such government is the government of Vatican City. Fun fact, Vatican City is the smallest country in the entire world, being wholly located in the city of Rome in Italy. Now, the leader of Vatican City is obviously the Pope, Pope of the Catholic Church, right? So the Pope will be the government, the essentially the highest authority in Vatican City when it comes to governance of Vatican City itself. Okay, so he obviously rules in the name of God, right? He is considered divinely guided by not just the government officials, not just by the citizens of Vatican City, but also to millions of people around the world as well. Okay, yeah, so that is an example of a theocracy. Now, a monarchy, that's something you might be a little bit more familiar with. A monarchy is when the supreme authority of the state, so the highest authority, the highest authority of the state is vested in a single, usually hereditary figure, such as a monarchy can come in the form of where we have a king or queen or emperor or empress, for example. Usually these people are more hereditary, so if this person's father was the king, then more likely than not his son or his daughter will become the next king or queen after the passing of the father. right? So yeah. So interestingly enough, the monarchy in the past, obviously, given the title of king or emperor, right, the power used to be absolute. But in today's modern world, these monarchies exist, but the monarchs themselves, their power varies from absolute power. So they have absolute control, which is essentially a tyrannical government as well, or authoritarian government. I mean, to even some countries where there are no power, the monarch has no power whatsoever. Okay, so they are just what we call a figurehead. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard this word before. So a figurehead is essentially a just a face lah, to act as a essentially the face of the government or the face of the country. Right, so a lot of countries do have such monarchs. For example, the UK with Queen Elizabeth, right? She is the constitutionally wise, she is the supreme authority of the United Kingdom, but in today's world, obviously the decision power goes to the government of the UK. Okay, so although theoretically she does have the power to do stuff like declare war and suspend the government and establish martial law and stuff like that, she doesn't do it because the UK today is still a democracy, right? As it has been for many, many years. Okay, yeah, so another example would be Japan with their emperor. So, history students, right after World War II, the emperor of Japan essentially became mostly a figurehead essentially. So, no power whatsoever when it comes to the monarch's authority, right? Some countries there are viable power, right? So, for example, Saudi Arabia, countries like in the Middle East with the emirs and the crown princes and stuff, those are the monarchs which have absolute power over the functioning and governance of their country. A republic. Okay, this one should be very familiar. Singapore is a republic by itself, right? So it is where the authority is derived based on the will of the people. So this is not not supposed to be an authoritarian type of government. So essentially, the citizens, what they say do matter when it comes to be the decisions that are made by the government. Why? Because the authority of the government is wholly derived on citizen vote. If the citizens don't vote their representative into office, into power, then they have no power, what? Right? So a republic, okay, although it's a general term, can be used to describe a lot of countries, but most of the time it is one where citizens will essentially gives these government authority their figure. Their power, their figure. Yeah. So it gives the, for example, the ministers, it gives the MPs their power. So citizens give the representative power. Okay, so it is what we call derived power. Okay, yeah. So derived power. Yes. Okay. Last one, I think. Communism. All right. Communism is a system of government where the state owns and operates industry on behalf of the people. So I think most of you will understand that communism or is like it's a system where like everything belongs to the state. It is not yours, it is ours, right? So the idea of everything is shared, ours, right? Uh no, you don't really need to understand communism that much unless you study history, or then in that case then you should be really very familiar with it. But the USSR was essentially the first communist state, I guess you can call it that. But they didn't really achieve communism, as you would know. Today, communist states, supposedly, communist states include Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, North Korea, and so on. And China, yes, China. Yeah. Okay, so that is just a little interesting part about the systems of governance. I think it's a good thing that you need to. So it's a good thing that you do know these systems of governance. All right, it gives you a good breadth of general knowledge, but you don't exactly need to memorize them all. What you do need to know is in this part onwards. Okay, let's take a look. All right, challenges in decision making. This part we're going to talk about what are the challenges when it comes to making decisions in a representative democracy. So Singapore lah, okay? Representative democracy. So republic. Okay? So in a representative democracy, since all right, the power is derived, again, derived power, the government needs to hear from all sections of society about what they want, what they need, and what they desire. Okay, so the people, government cannot just say everything as such. They need to listen to different views because not everybody in the society, not all citizens will have the same view. Okay, so what we call the common good, the common good would be the final decision needs to be made, so majority decision. So they would usually do what would benefit the majority of citizens. Okay, and of course those we cannot satisfy everybody, right? So the government also needs to come up with a good answer for why some citizens needs had to be rejected for this common good. Okay, so differing needs and interests, the first challenge comes with this: we can agree that everybody needs food and water. Okay, so these are basic, so everybody needs it. However, when it comes to subsidiary things, for example, road transportation or train transportation, right? People start to have different needs. Car owner needs and commuter needs, right? Completely different. If you don't own a car, you use the MRT to go to work or you go to school every day using the MRT or bus service, then obviously what happens with car owners, like the certificate of entitlement COE, doesn't really matter to you that much. So the needs are different in this case, right? Car owners probably would want the government to focus and put the resource into building roads, better expressway, better facilities. For example, nowadays we got stuff like electric vehicles, so they would want the government to focus on building those ports, right, EV ports, so that the electric vehicles can charge. Conversely, if we're talking about MRT commuters or we're talking about bus commuters, they would usually want the government to focus on what? Trying to, make the MRT service as efficient as possible, to build even more MRT stations to make Singapore well connected. Bus services, ensuring that bus come on time, MRT bus don't break down, stuff like that. So you can see needs, different citizens, their needs when it comes to this secondary stage is completely different. But given that the government has limited resource in its own, especially in Singapore, they have to decide on how to best use these resources for the greater good. You will always hear this term, greater good, right? Because there's no way we can satisfy everyone. So we can try our best to satisfy as many people as possible. And there are some people that obviously will get mad because their needs were not met. But unfortunately, that's how the world works. Second part, differing priorities. Okay, so just now we said different needs and interests. Now we talk about different priorities. For example, everybody may agree that we need to improve education in Singapore. We need to improve healthcare in Singapore. But which should the government do and focus on first? People will disagree on that again. Okay, a person's status and identity may have a part to play. For example, if it was, for example, a parent with children that are going to school, obviously they want the government to focus more funding for Ministry of Education to get better resources for schools, to give the student more opportunities and whatnot. Conversely, if you were a senior citizen, you would want the government to fund Ministry of Health more, to improve healthcare system, to give more subsidies for healthcare bills, to make access to healthcare even more affordable or more efficient. For example, during the COVID pandemic, this has become a important priority, right? So these disagreements, they obviously do cause some sort of tension, some sort of negative impact on our society. Even in some cases, our representatives that are in parliament may not even be able to reach a consensus and thus cannot implement any policies. For example, if you take a look at what is going on in the United States, right? Because their system has representatives from constituencies and parties that have varying, very different views on the same issue. For example, this half of the legislature supports this issue, or the other half of the legislature does not support this issue. As a result, they cannot come to a consensus, which means without consensus, nothing can be done. Even when it comes to stuff like, for example, recently there's been quite sadly there's a lot of school shootings in the US, or even the distribution of COVID, what you call it, COVID subsidies and things to help business owners and people get over the economic depressions of the caused by the COVID pandemic. They cannot even come to a consensus on that, which causes things that are very important, decisions that need to be made, to not be able to be made in an efficient manner. And this is one of the downfalls of democracy, or a republic as we know it, because sometimes in these matters it does take quite a long time to decide on what is supposedly best for the most amount of people. Okay, yeah. So this is the second challenge: differing priorities. What should come first? What should the government focus on first? Third, unequal sharing of costs. Right? So an unequal sharing cost is the third challenge in decision making. Essentially, we know that some developments, some improvements are very important and it will benefit a lot of people. However, when these infrastructure, for example, are being built, the people who are affected by the development, people that have to bear the cost, is very different. For example, if I build highway or I build MRT tracks right near a residential block, yes, this MRT line or this highway will be able to serve millions of Singaporeans every single day. But the development of this highway system or this MRT track will cause a lot of noise, a lot of disruption, a lot of dust, especially for the people that are living in the area of the construction. So you always hear noise outside, right? Singapore is a country that's always under development, right? So although it will help a lot of people, but the people who bear the cost of the decision is very different. Some people will definitely be affected more than others. Okay, so those people that live near the development are said to bear the most cost, right? Even though a lot of people are benefiting, they bear the most cost for the development. So it is standard behavior, right? We want improvements in our country, but we don't want inconvenience. Okay, so this sometimes gives rise to what we call the NIMBY syndrome. This is a very important concept that you need to know. NIMBY syndrome, not in my backyard. Okay, so essentially they don't want inconvenience. They want development, don't get me wrong, they do want these improvements, but they just don't want it to affect them. So they just want the benefits, but they don't want the inconvenience. And of course, given that this is a representative democracy, this can hamper our desire to make improvements for anything really in Singapore. Okay, so NIMBY syndrome, you can quote a few examples. For example, there was one at the Toh Guan estate, or there was one at even Bishan, right, where the government wanted to build these elder care homes, right? But the residents in the nearby area said, no, don't build the elder care homes. massive inconvenience for the residents. There are a lot of elderly. We have to care for the elderly sometimes, for example, right? It's just a hassle for a lot of the residents there. So they told the government, we don't want this in our backyards. We want a place where we want a place where elder care can be provided, but just not next to our flats. Okay, I hope you understand that. These people are not against benefit. They are simply against the inconvenience that have to be derived as a result of getting these benefits. That's what they don't like, and as a result, they reject this type of proposal. Okay, in Singapore especially, this is very concerning. Why? Because we only have that amount of land. So every square kilometer of land, every acre of land to Singapore is very, very precious. Okay, with more NIMBY syndrome, all right, perhaps these lands that can be used to host a lot of different things that will benefit people end up not being able to be used because the residents, they don't like the inconvenience that come with it. Okay, yeah, so there is unequal sharing, of course. So next part, we'll talk about how we can manage these problems, this challenge. Okay, first things first, we have a trade-off. Okay, I'm sure you heard of this term before. Now, a trade-off is a situation where we must choose between or balance two things that are opposite or cannot be had at the same time. For example, I have only this amount of money. All right, the government has this amount of money that they allocated to transportation infrastructure. I can either, spend all the money to build better highway, or I can spend all the money to build a new MRT line. A trade-off is a situation usually where the government says we have to satisfy the needs of these people, both the people that own cars and the people that take MRT. But obviously we cannot allocate all this amount to either one of these. If not, the other one cannot make it. Okay, a trade-off is, for example, the government says, okay, how about we take this sum of money, we split it in half, equal half. Half of it will go to highway infrastructure. Half of it will go to MRT line. That is what we call a trade-off. So essentially, we are creating a balance. Okay, we know that we'll never be able to satisfy everybody completely. So we try to make the best out of the situation, and we try to make life better for as many people as humanly possible. Okay, so the government needs to handle the needs and interests, but they also need to consider the available resources that are disposal to them. Oh dear. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so like I said, the government needs to manage this need interest, but there is limited resources, so they need to prioritize. Right, okay, moving on. An example that you can use that I would usually recommend students to use is this Thomson East Coast Line example. I'm sure you know Thomson East Coast Line has already opened, partially, of course, right? So, when they were planning to build this Thomson East Coast Line, right, they had to abandon some plans to build the commercial residential buildings on that parcel of land that the MRT line was going to pass through overhead. Okay, so although it is a blowback for some of these commercial residential development, for example HDB estates, right, but it was seen as necessary. Why? Because the MRT line could benefit potentially hundreds of thousands of people on a daily basis. So the government is not easy to be a government. It's not easy to be a policy maker because you gotta make decisions like this pretty much every single day. Yeah. So the skill number one thing we can do is to trade off. We do a trade off to manage this conflicting demand. Next, power sharing. Okay, so this was what I was talking about previously, the separation of power. Okay, so in this case we were talking about Singapore as a democracy. All right, the representatives derive their legitimacy from the citizens. Okay, so these people have the legitimacy to make the decisions for the citizens, especially when it comes to conflicting interests and demand. Okay, let's zoom in and let's take a look. First, let's talk about the legislature. Now, the legislature, right, you would notice that the word legislature is very closely, uh, is quite close to the another word is called legislation. And that's because they are pretty much the same thing. Legislature are people that make legislation. Legislation being law. Okay, so these are the people that come up with the laws for the country. So Parliament in Singapore comprises of the Speaker of Parliament, the PM, Prime Minister, elected MPs, NCMPs, and NMPs. Okay, so the Speaker, currently Mr. Tan Chuan Jin, right? They are elected at the start of the new Parliament by MPs. Okay, so the Speaker is usually an MP lah in Singapore. They are the one that regulate and enforce the rule of debate. So if you do watch some excerpts of these parliament sittings, they is the person that usually says, "Oh, your time is elapsed. Please stop talking," or who calls on people to speak. Okay, he also puts forth questions for the parliament to actually debate on and vote, and of course that will eventually become an act of parliament. Speaker himself does not take part in any of the legislation debates, but he does have a vote if he is an MP. Okay, but the main key thing of the speaker's role is that they must remain impartial and fair to all MPs, no matter if the speaker is from the People's Action Party. Doesn't matter if there are MPs from Workers' Party or any other opposition party. He must be impartial and fair, so he cannot like keep appointing PAP MPs to speak and not care about the WP MPs or the whoever other opposition MPs. He must be fair. Okay, elected MPs, that would be the people you're more familiar with. Usually you have your own MPs. I'm sure you know your own MPs, right? So these are the people that you see actually running for election. Okay, so uh, you I mean I'm sure you know your constituency. Hopefully you know your constituency, but they come into SMCs or 4 to 5 member GRCs. Now GRC is a concept we're going to come back to at a later time when we talk about diversity. Okay, but you just need to know that SMCs and GRCs are the two types of constituencies we have in Singapore. Okay, also, all right, these are the people that you vote into parliament. So the people that win the general election, these are your elected MPs. However, Singapore has a very interesting system where we appoint NCMPs, your non-constituency members of parliament. So as of 2020, I know your textbook says something else, but as of 2020, Constitution says there are 12 NCMPs. Okay, so NCMPs are sometimes they call them uh, the best losers, for example. So although they lost their general election in that constituency, but they perform the best out of all the losing candidates in the entire general election in Singapore. Okay, and they are eligible for this NCMP seat. Okay, so NCMPs are usually from opposition party lah. Okay, and they have obtained not less than 15% of the total number of votes and polled the highest percentage of votes amongst losers at the general elections. Okay, the best losers. Yeah, so these people although they don't have their own constituency, which means they don't run their town council, they don't do meet the people sessions or whatever. They are just there in parliament to broaden the diversity of views. Okay, so this is to broaden views, so a more diverse representation of citizens. Why? Because the fact that they are the best losers, they are polling so high, although they did not win, or actually already means something, that quite a good bit of Singaporeans actually want these people in parliament. So founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew came up with a system to give the opposition a voice. And back then it was quite rare for opposition, so this is just an avenue for the opposition to be represented in parliament in Singapore. Now, of course, today our opposition party routinely wins some seats, right? But of course, this system still exists. If, for example, more than 12 opposition MPs do win seats in the parliament in the general elections, then NCMPs, there are no NCMPs anymore. Okay? Nominated members of parliament. So these are the people. Oh dear, my thing is freaking out. Okay, these people are NMPs. These are people that are not elected. They did not take part in the general elections. These are people who are appointed by a special select committee who advises the president. The president of Singapore will appoint 9 NMPs to serve a term of 2.5 years in parliament. So their job essentially is to represent different parts of the community. Represents different parts of community. So they are not like a politician essentially. They are not belonging to any party. They don't have any affiliation. Okay, their main job is essentially to just represent the community they belong to and to contribute their independent points of view in parliament. So they cannot vote on constitutional matter. They don't vote on stuff that may affect say constituencies, elections, stuff like that. No, all they do is to contribute independent voice of views. For example, most of the times we have people that are from the art sector or from the sports sector. These are people that are usually called on. People belonging to these industries are usually called on to be NMPs in parliament. Okay, next, general elections. So the general elections in Singapore will be held usually once every 4 or 5 years, right? So the process is essentially when the PM advises president about the election, right? So they will dissolve parliament and they will issue the writ of election. So during the election, people will decide, obviously they will decide which group of candidates they wish to represent them in parliament. Okay, so the people that, or group of candidates that have the most number of votes in each constituency will serve as MPs in the next parliament. So the new parliament will be formed, the president will appoint the PM, alright, and so PM must command the confidence of the majority of MPs in parliament. If not, this prime minister cannot be a leader if he cannot even command the majority of MPs that are voted in. Okay, and all MPs will be sworn in, and then Parliament will convene as per normal. Parliament has 3 main functions. Okay, first function we discussed already: debate and pass law. Second is to be overseers of the spending of finances, and third, to serve as the committee of supply. Now, first things first, to debate and pass laws. In Singapore, bills are debated very, very extensively, okay? And it goes through an entire process, which I'll go through with you now. First, first, first step is the first reading, okay? This is when a bill is just freshly introduced by an MP or group of MPs, okay? Second stage would be second reading. This is when the actual debate on the bill will begin. So MPs will talk about, oh, this bill is good in this area. It does talk about this, blah, 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 blah. Some people may say, oh, this bill needs to be amended here. This language is not clear or whatever. Okay, a bill will need the support of a majority of MPs present before it can proceed to the next stage. Okay, so the support of a majority of MPs is required for most of the bills to be passed. Okay, just note that okay, act is always a bill that has been passed. When a bill, okay, when it's still known as a bill, it means that this bill, this piece of legislation is only proposed. It has not passed and it is not law yet. Okay. After the second reading, what comes up? A lot of people are surprised to see that it's not the third reading. It is in fact the stage of committee. Okay, I think let's put that slide up here. Okay, so oh my goodness. Okay, yeah. So step 3 will be committee. Okay, so there are two types of committees in Parliament: the select committee and the committee of a whole house. Okay, for most bills, all right, it will go to step 3B, which is a committee of whole house. All the MPs will form a committee. They will talk about the clauses and propose amendments. This is when they actually go into the nitty-gritty of the language of the bill, the merits, the flaws of this particular bill, and then they make amendments in order for the final bill to be passed. Some instances, all right, select committees are formed. So only several MPs will be convened and they will talk about this bill amongst themselves in this select committee. The public also sometimes may be asked to give their view on this bill itself. The select committee will then present their findings to Parliament as a whole house, and then they will talk about amendments and see how it goes from there. So after committee stage comes third reading. Step 4, third reading. So this is when the final bill, the final document is already drafted. Okay, usually nobody will request any amendments. Okay, only minor things like a grammar problem or something. These can be amended, but this is the stage where the bill is finalized and MPs will vote on adoption. Okay, if there are major amendments, then it has to go back to the previous stage already. Fifth, Presidential Council for Minority Rights. Okay, this is another thing that is quite unique to Singapore itself. Okay, so this is a system that essentially protects minority rights. Okay, so it ensures that whatever law that is passed by Parliament doesn't discriminate against a certain minority group. So this is what we call differentiating measure. The PCMR will determine if there is a differentiating measure inside this bill. Okay, so anything that can be disadvantageous to a certain racial or religious minority, the PCMR will pick up. The council will then submit the report to Parliament. If they say, hey, there is a differentiating measure here, you're discriminating against this because of this certain clause, this certain this certain article, then Parliament will talk about it, they will try to change it and then send it back. Okay, but if it's decided that it doesn't contain any differentiating measure, it's sent to the speaker it is given to the speaker so that the speaker can send the final version of the bill to the president for assent. Okay, after all of that, once the president of Singapore signs the bill, or what we call assents to the bill, so essentially is saying that the president agrees and approves this bill, it becomes an act of parliament. Okay, so it only becomes an official act of Singapore when it is published in the Gazette, right, and it is coming into operation. Okay, yeah. So the Gazette is essentially this big database of all the notices that are published by the Singapore government. So anything to relating about acts, laws, subsidiary legislation, notices, and memorandums, all of these things are put in the gazette for everybody to see. Okay, so that is the entire process on how uh, legislation laws get passed in Singapore. Next, the second function of parliament is the government finances. So I've combined committee of supply and government finance together because they are essentially similar. Okay, I'm really sorry for all the glitches that you see. I'm not sure what's going on with the screen today. Okay, parliament functions of government finance. Okay, COS. I'm sure you heard this term before. It's always in the news every March, every single year. Okay, so this is, like I said, is a committee, right? So remember we talked about committee just now. Yeah, so COS is the committee where parliament will discuss the expenditure, so how much the government is going to spend in the next financial year. Okay, so the ministries, the ministers will make the request for the funds. Oh, I want to do this, I need this amount of money to do this, and then the committee will consider each ministry request and then they vote on it to approve that budget. Okay, so MPs, all of them have a pact. Okay, the pact is to raise debates on the specific policies and programs of the ministry. If the member of parliament say, hey, this program like not very useful, huh? They can start a debate on that specific policy, and then the ministers, they must respond to it, they must defend their policies and to convince the parliament that they deserve the money for that. Okay, they can also, MPs can also propose a nominal cut, so they can cut $100 each time to the ministry estimate. Okay, yeah, so once committee is voted on the estimates, it report the decision to the parliament, which is essentially the same people, just different name. Okay, then they debate again, they vote on the amount of money that the government can spend in total in the coming financial year, and then the bill will be given to the president for the assent. Once the bill is assented, it becomes a money bill. Okay, and then it becomes a money act, sorry. Then in this new financial year, the government is authorized to withdraw the amount of money it wants from the treasury to spend on these policies that they discussed. Okay, so it must be able to meet the expenditure, or withdraw the expenditure, withdraw money to meet this expenditure as contained in the law that they passed. There are some instances where it may be necessary in spirit of national defense or whatnot to withdraw more money than estimated to respond to certain things. For example, when the COVID pandemic first hit, right, the government did withdraw a significant amount of money from the treasury in order to respond to the pandemic by either by giving the subsidies, and to improve healthcare infrastructure, to invest in infectious disease research and vaccine distribution, and all these things all require money. Okay, people, they all require money. And of course, the president, which we'll talk about later, is the person that will oversee that the government is not spending this money anyhow. Okay, okay, yeah, executive branch. Executive, all right, is the people that will actually execute the law. Okay, so just now we talked about the legislature. The people that make the law is known as the legislature. The executive will be the people that execute the law, right? Okay, so executive comprises of PM, DPM, and the ministers. The executive prepares government policies and oversees the day-to-day administration of Singapore. Okay, so these are the people that actually plan and implement the different policies that are passed by a parliament or suggested by the ministries. So as of 2021, there are 16 government ministries. Ministry of Comms and Information is the people that usually are in charge of the info communication, media, and whatnot. MSE, Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment. Okay, of course, the name environment, they are in charge of the environment. This used to be Ministry of Environment and Water Resources, I think, but now that we are focusing more on sustainability, they changed the name. Next, Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, MCCY. Okay, these are the people that are in charge of the heritage part of Singapore and also sports and innovation. MOF, Ministry of Finance, obviously, the people in charge of financial issues in Singapore. Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we'll talk about MFA next unit, in the next unit. So these are people that are in charge of managing foreign relations with countries. MINDEF, Ministry of Defence, the people that are in charge of Singapore's defence, okay, external defence, so our army, our air force, our navy, and recently there's a new digital branch here. That's all MINDEF. We'll talk about MINDEF as well in the next unit. MOH, Ministry of Health, the people who are in charge of ensuring that Singapore is able to keep up with stuff like infectious diseases, to control spread of diseases, and to promote good health and reduce illness. Of course, it will also be in charge of making healthcare affordable for all Singaporeans. Okay, we'll talk more about this in diversity when we talk about healthcare system. Okay, MHA, Ministry of Home Affairs, right? So these are the people that essentially oversee the internal security of Singapore. So the people that run the police force, internal security department, civil defense force, and whatnot. Okay, MOE, we should be all very familiar with MOE by now, right? The people that are in charge of education. Ministry of Law, MOL. These are the people that are in charge of adjudication to provide services like the public defender service for people that are going on trial, for example. Okay, next page. Ministry of Transport. Okay, obviously people that are in charge of transportation, so and anywhere from air, land and sea, all under them. Any air, land and sea transportation is under MOT. MOM, Ministry of Manpower. Okay, these are people that are in charge of the manpower distribution, work permits and whatnot. MND, Ministry of National Development. These are people that are in charge of infrastructure like HDB blocks, like sports complexes, shopping malls, all of them. These are under MND. Building and Construction Authority is also under MND. MSF, Ministry of Social and Family Development. These are the people that are in charge of anything relating to family development, essentially. So people that issue or have counseling services, mediation services, these all fall under MSF, right? MTI, Ministry of Trade and Industry. These are people that do the estimates of forecasts for jobs and to see where there are areas for expansion of manpower or industry that we can make use of in Singapore. And PMO, right? PMO, although many people don't actually know that PMO is a sort of a ministry, but the PMO, given that it is in direct coordination by the Prime Minister, there are some agencies and bureaus that are directly under the control of the Prime Minister, okay, as the coordinator for all execution of law. So you can just read the different things that are under the PMO. Alright, I'm not going to go into detail about that. Okay, the third, the screen just changed back. Okay, the third and final branch of the government of Singapore is the judiciary. Okay, so the judiciary is the people that ensures that the government follows the constitution and to ensure that the laws are adjudicated. So people that break laws, right, this is the judiciary will be the people that hand out the punishments to them. So judiciary in Singapore comprises of the Supreme Court, State Courts, and Family Justice Court. Okay, the head of the judiciary is known as the Chief Justice. So I've drawn a little diagram here to show you the different courts that are in the Singapore court system. Okay, so Supreme Court is this blue box here. This is the highest court of the land. Okay, so these are people that are dealing with final courts of appeal. Okay, high court is under the Supreme Court as well. So this is the where you usually see these serious criminal cases and civil cases usually go straight to the high court. Okay, they also hear appeals from the smaller court lah. This is the state courts. State courts, these are local level courts. So in the district itself, or when there is a coroner's inquiry, community disputes, magistrates will be those of small penalties, small things. Small claims tribunals is a civil law, and a community court. Okay, yeah. So family justice court is another section. These are people that actually hear problems relating to family, for example, domestic abuse, the issuance of personal protection orders and stuff like that. These all fall under family justice court. Okay. Moving on. Okay, so managing conflicting demands. So having the good separation of power and having that clear distinction of what each organ of government needs to do, okay, that allows us to better manage conflicting demands. Decision making is not done by one person or one group alone. The executive needs legislature to approve decision. Executive needs judiciary to ensure that the decision is made within the laws of the land. Government can only carry out laws through the cabinet that the PM appoints. Laws is implemented by these ministries and enforced by the judiciary. By distributing power, they are able to make trade-off well, managing conflicting demands, and to maintain very, very importantly, checks and balances. Okay, this is a very important term, check and balance, so that nobody gets too much power. And if somebody gets too much power, that is a very, very scary scenario. Last but not least, the last section for this chapter is ideas shaping governance. Okay, ideas shaping governance, okay, is what we believe is the best kind of governance, good governance. So qualities that make a government good. Okay, having good leadership, that is number one. Okay, it is very, very important that leaders of our government are honest and capable, so that they are trustworthy and they can actually do their job well. Okay, they must have the moral courage to do what is right, even though certain decisions may not be popular, certain decisions that may cause them to be less popular with the people, may cause them to lose election, but they must know what is the right thing to do in that circumstances for the betterment of the majority. Leaders must have the right values. Okay, corruption is not tolerated in Singapore. Okay, corrupt leaders will only take the money, for example, the resources, and benefit themselves. They don't benefit the country. Okay, so yeah, so incorruptible leaders are needed if we want a country to prosper. Singapore is one of the least corrupt countries in the world. Okay, and this is all because Singapore as a foundation, since the very day that we gain independence, we have focused on this idea that corruption cannot be tolerated in Singapore. Okay, politicians in Singapore will be taken to account for what they do. They are not above the law. Okay, if they break any laws of the land, they will be brought to justice. Okay, for example, lying in parliament, right? So that case itself is showing you that corruption is not tolerated, or any form of dishonesty is not tolerated, and they will be removed from positions of power and given the appropriate punishment in due accordance with the law. Okay, next. Second point, anticipating change and staying relevant. A good government needs to do this. What does this mean? Okay, although certain policies we adopt as a government does make sense, okay, and they do think, hey, actually this will benefit people now, but a good government must also understand that good policy should also benefit people in the long term. Government is not just here for today and today only. They must also be forward thinking. If they don't plan ahead, if they don't make, decisions that benefit the future, then the country itself will never prosper because they are not ready at all for the future. For example, the integrated resorts. These are your casinos, Marina Bay Sands, and the Sentosa, the what's it called? Resorts World Sentosa. Yes. So these are IRs. Okay. When the IR thing was being proposed and approved by the government in I think the late 2010s, it was actually quite a big issue of contention for a lot of Singaporeans. Okay, so this actually led to a lot of protests in Singapore, which is quite rare if you didn't know, right? Protests in Singapore are quite rare, especially in that time. Social costs needed to be weighed against economic benefits. The government argued that yes, IRs, the building of these integrated resorts, the casinos and whatnot, they will bring a lot of economic benefit for Singapore. But at the same time, there were many severe social costs that could come up with this building of these casino. IRs are essentially a way to make money lah, obviously, right? And this money that the government gained from building these casinos and people visiting these casinos, they can be used for better things, for nation building. And so because the government had to consider the long-term survival of the country, they went ahead and approved the IR. However, they also know that there are social costs that needs to be dealt with. So they mitigated this by establishing the National Council of Problem Gambling. Okay, this is to agency to educate the people on why gambling is difficult. No, sorry, why gambling is dangerous, and also if there are compulsive gamblers that are affecting their families, affecting themselves, then NCPG will actually give them counseling service as well. So that is anticipating change and staying relevant. We cannot afford to be dormant. We have to keep moving. We have to keep improving. That is a sign of a good government. Third, providing a stake for everyone. Okay, providing a stake for everyone essentially means that citizens are involved in decision making. When citizens are involved in decision making, naturally they develop this greater sense of belonging. Okay, with a greater sense of belonging, they are more likely to contribute back to the community. Remember, this is what we talked about in Unit 1 last time, right? Okay, so the government has created many opportunities to allow citizens to show their views. Our Singapore conversation is something that I think started in 2015, okay, and it lasted for a few years. This is actually a year-long effort, right? So this is actually something that allow Singaporeans during that time to share their views on how to make Singapore a better place for everyone to live in. So the government actually, came out with these forums and suggestion boxes, and even using back then the social media technology to engage Singaporeans and to invite them to share their opinions on what they thought could be better done for the country. Okay, another thing is also public housing. So HDB itself, right? Everybody wants to get a HDB flat, BTO, right? However, we must understand that home ownership, apart from being a sense of having somewhere to live, right, it is also, to the government, it is a way to boost Singaporeans' sense of belonging through housing grants, through support subsidy schemes. A lot of Singaporeans today, especially couples, get to live in these HDB flats, get to live in these BTOs. Okay, this actually builds a sense of belonging because, hey, I own a house. This is now where I will set up my family. This is where my children will grow up. This is where I'll grow old and whatnot. this sense of belonging, actually a lot of people don't actually realize how important home ownership is when it comes to national identity. But this is something that the government realized, okay, and that's why it's put under providing a stake for everyone. This is still a say in decision making, because now that we give people the opportunity to own houses, this directly influence any policy that will affect building of HDB flats, uh, when it comes to affordability of these HDB flats, especially with the less and less amount of land that Singapore has. Probably HDB flats are going to increase in price. So perhaps when you grow older, HDB flats will become quite expensive, I would suppose lah. Okay, yeah, so that's providing stake for everyone. Okay, next page. Next we'll talk about, oops, I seem to have jumped too far. Last idea here, practicing meritocracy. Now, personally, I do not agree with meritocracy in its entirety, but I think it's still important to acknowledge that it does have benefit, especially when Singapore first started as a country. Now, meritocracy simply refers to rewarding people according to their benefits, according to their efforts, and not due to any differentiating factor. Okay, so doesn't mean you are of a certain race or you're of a certain you earn a lot of money, then you get more, benefits, you get more opportunities. No. Okay, Singapore is very, very adamant. I'm sure you know that meritocracy is important and is what has achieved Singapore's success so far. Okay, so apparently it's human nature to work harder when people are rewarded based on their abilities and efforts, right? As students, I'm sure you know stuff like EduSave scholarship, stuff like merit bursary schemes. All of these things are essentially meritocracy. Okay, so students are rewarded for good behavior or rewarded for good academic achievements, which inspire them to work harder. And of course, good education, good results will allow them to be more competitive in this world economy. Okay, so however, there are of course problems that arise with meritocracy itself. Okay, some groups of people will end up benefiting more than other groups of people over time, because it is sad truth that successful families will still be able to give their children a good head start as compared to people who are from disadvantaged families. Okay, this is where Singapore practices something that's really interesting in my idea, is that this is called compassionate meritocracy. Lifting the bottom. Right? If you've listened to enough MOE press conferences, you will always hear this term, lifting the bottom. Singapore emphasizes that privileged people must ensure that less privileged people can succeed also. Compassionate meritocracy. You might see this in some of your source-based questions, right? Where the source will talk about, compassionate meritocracy, is it working, is it effective, whatnot. But you need to understand that this is what it means, lifting the bottom. Not suppressing the top, lifting the bottom so that they can achieve success as well. Obviously, meritocracy is not just for education, right? You will get meritocracy, or you'll come into contact with meritocracy hopefully throughout your entire life. Okay, and because Singaporeans, no matter how old you are, should be giving your best to wherever you're working, and of course to the country as well. However, overuse of meritocracy is resulting in what we know today as a toxic competition, right? Sadly, I think a lot of you are too familiar with this as well, right? So there may be general discontent caused by competitive nature of this compassionate meritocracy system. Okay, as a result, it does cause a severe social impact, especially on the young people of today, because in today's world, as compared to 20-30 years ago, it has become even more competitive in the world economy. Okay, so as a result, unfortunately, we do see cases of mental illness, decreased efficiency, and failure of the system being brought into play here, being brought into people's attention. Okay, and of course, this is, as a good government, things need to be addressed, things need to be adapted, so that we can ensure that these type of problems do not come about again in the future, and definitely still maintain Singapore's competitiveness on the world stage. Okay, so in conclusion, meritocracy, along with the other three principles, must be modified to ensure they maintain relevance in the future. Okay, the ideas shaping governments will continue to evolve to meet the changing needs of Singapore. Remember what we said, staying relevant, anticipating change. Okay, this is not a one size fit all. Governance will never remain the same at, like 20 years ago, governance was different. 20 years in the future, it's probably going to be different again. Okay, so it must be modified. We must adapt what we know today in order to fit a future context. Okay, maintaining relevance. Okay, what worked 50 years ago may not work today. What works today may not work 50 years in the future. In order for country to progress, we need to keep having these changes, and a good government needs to continue to adapt with this system and adapt the policies that come along with it. Okay, and with that, we have concluded this unit. All right, deciding what is good for society. We have learned the different types of systems of governance. We have learned about the challenges that decision-making process does face. We've talked about how we can manage these challenges, and we have talked about what makes a good government. Okay, I hope you learned something from today's lecture, and I hope you found it quite interesting. And I wish you all the very best in your revision for your O levels and other exams that are coming your way. Okay, we are here with you, and yeah, all the best, and I'll see you next time. Right.